So today we're going to talk, my presentation is called An Introduction to Street Photography from Beginner to Advanced Topics. And as I mentioned, this is going to kind of take you through the gamut of like everything I really think you need to know just to kind of get started and comfortable in this genre. I'm going to show, let me click on here. I'm going to show my work throughout. The work early on is going to be a mixture of different things, color, black and white, just some kind of top hits and favorites that I like. And then as I get further down towards the more advanced things that I talk about, it's going to get a little bit more consistent. And I'm going to talk about kind of my projects that I've been working on and things like that. And I'll talk about some of the images and some of them I'll hold back on. And maybe halfway through, I'll pause for some questions as well. So the first thing is just to talk about the definition of street photography. Street photography is a really difficult thing to define. A lot of people have kind of different ideas of what it is. This is my view of what I think street photography is. So it's basically candid nature of photography, candid photography of life, culture, and human nature. It's a way for us to show our surroundings, how we perceive them, and how we relate to them. And the relationship that we have to the surroundings is really important. I think this type of photography is kind of a mixture between like documentary work and personal work. It's kind of like somewhere in between the two. You know, documentary work is often the photographer trying to be as impartial as possible. Whereas this type of photography, we're trying to, you know, really show how we feel about what we see to the viewers. And if you look at the kind of work of some of the great photographers who have done this for a long time, no matter what, you know, if they're shooting in color this day or black and white this day, you know, you really can see who they are and their sensibilities in their work. So I think that's really important to the genre. And I said here, we're filtering what we see to find moments that intrigue us. And it's very important, not just on the street or in cities. It can be done anywhere and people don't have to be present. Street photography is more of a sensibility. And, you know, you talk about like the grass being always greener. A lot of people say, you know, I wish I was, you know, in New York City, you know, it's such a great place for street photography. There's so many people. A lot of my favorite work personally being from here is work that's done completely in different areas. I love William Eggleston. He's one of my favorite photographers. And you know, I love this type of work done in more suburban and quiet areas around the country. And I love some of the photographs will have kind of consistencies between the two. I just like showing these two together. This is a portrait, but when I do a lot of portraits, so people on the street, I wait for moments where they maybe don't know necessarily that I'm photographing them or think I'm taking a break or something, or just a moment of talking to them and they get in kind of their own world. And so that's when I love to take the photographs. So you see a few of those here. And it helps if they have the Louis Vuitton logos tattooed on their head. This one I like just that it looks similar to this. I keep these two together, but this is a bathroom wall of a very touristy place in New York, and I just love to read all the messages here. In the middle it says "Kill the rich and eat their young," and there's a lot of really interesting things here to read. So quickly we'll talk about ethics, laws, and very important, don't be a creep with this photography, which, you know, it is a bit of a creepy form of photography, or it can be. So important, it's legal in the US and UK for artistic and educational purposes. That is for anything that you might, you know, if you think about if you painted a painting, you know, and what could you do with it? You can put it in a book of your work, you can advertise a show, you can put it in a show. Those are the uses that you can use for this type of work. You can't use it for any commercial or advertising purposes without a model release. And you can't use it to insinuate anything directly about a person. I was doing a workshop with someone. She was maybe a 19-year-old young woman, and she said that, you know, someone had taken her picture, and she woke up one morning with a lot of people texting her saying, you know, I had no idea, you know, you're so brave and stuff like that. And it turns out that somehow that picture found its way into a local news article about anorexia. and bulimia, and that she wasn't either of those, but somehow that photo found its way there. That's a situation, if you insinuate someone about something, you can definitely get sued. And also, I think it's important to think about when you're traveling different countries. A lot of countries have completely different rules, so you want to look up the local laws, but then also look at the work of local street photographers and see what they're doing, because in a lot of cases the rules aren't necessarily so clear. There's a lot of gray areas in certain places. And it's really important just to be smart and respectful about who you photograph. It's not always worth it to take someone's photo. And as I mentioned, it can be a little creepy, but that's okay. And we have to be okay with that. We're trying to photograph people in real moments just because we like them. Like, I like to capture my surroundings in the city and the people in it because it's just something I really love doing. And I like trying to connect with everyone that's around. And so it's just one of those things that, you kind of have to know how you come off when you're doing this type of work. And if you can do it in as respectful a way as possible, you really shouldn't have much of an issue. I've been shooting this type of work since, early 2000s. And, probably in the last 5 years, when I've been shooting by myself, I have not had one person stop me or say anything. I've had that happen many times, way back, but I'll show you, I'll kind of talk about how I shoot, and it's very non-confrontational, and I do it in a respectful way. So I really don't have many issues. And one thing when I do workshops with people, I see a few people do this. It's they take a lot of photos of someone. They'll see someone and they'll just kind of shoot. If a scene is developing, of course you want to wait to get the best possible photograph. But as I mentioned, you want to see, think about how you come off, and standing there with the camera at someone for a long time, shooting them over and over again, that can really cause trouble for both you and the person that you're photographing. Here's a guy who named Jerry, a local newsstand person who, this is a candid shot, but I waited for him to look up at me and just get that eye contact. We'll talk about emotion and gesture and things like that, but one of the things I look for the most is eyes, the look in the eyes. They don't necessarily have to look at you, but when I'm looking and scanning around for people, I really try to notice their eyes first, and I try to find people who are thinking something or have something going on. So these are the major tips. I think if you get these all down, you'll be a good portion of the way towards being kind of really comfortable with this genre. The first is to linger and let subjects come to you. Now, I got into this type of photography because I really just like to walk. It's kind of my way of de-stressing in the city. I like to get lost and explore new areas of New York, and because of that, I started taking a camera around with me. But within that, I like to stop frequently, and I like to just, find a place where I think something might be good, and I just let everything happen around me. And by doing that, especially if you're nervous with this type of photography, but even if you've been doing this for a very long time, it really makes you comfortable, and it allows the subjects to enter your personal space instead of you entering theirs. So it really changes the dynamic of, the kind of uncomfortableness that you can feel trying to photograph people that you haven't talked to. And what it also does is when you're kind of standing around instead of walking, you have a lot more, you notice a lot more of your surroundings. You're spending more of your energy and kind of brain power just looking around. And so I find that I'm a lot faster with the camera. I notice things better when I'm just kind of hanging out in a place versus walking from place to place. I do, of course, photograph when I'm walking around a lot as well. Now there's the camera snap, which when I see people photograph, pretty much all of them naturally will take a picture and they'll immediately take the camera away from their eye when they take a picture. It's just kind of a very subtle thing. And that's like the only way people know that you've taken their photograph. So this is kind of a really, super simple but sneaky tip. Just when you take a picture of someone, don't immediately take the camera away from your eye. Take the picture and then move the camera as if they were in your way, and then take the camera from your eye, or wait for them to walk through, just as if you were waiting to photograph something behind them. That will really a lot of confrontation or people kind of really questioning what you're doing. Keep your camera up. I'll show you after halfway through when we're doing questions, I'll show you how I like to hold the camera. But as often as possible, I like to try to keep my camera, hold my camera up a little higher. You know, I hold it, the Fuji X100 particularly, but also with the GFX, I hold it with one hand and then I kind of put the other hand to kind of prop my hand up, my arm up. And it's much easier to photograph in candid settings when your camera is already close to your eye. If you have it down kind of at your belly, and suddenly something amazing happens, it's, you know, hard and uncomfortable to just suddenly pick your camera up and photograph it. And it takes some time. So if you have your camera ready, if it's kind of close already, it makes you a lot faster. Even with the X100, my camera strap, I purposely have it probably higher than it's tighter and closer up than most photographers with their straps. Now, smiling is incredibly important. And I mean, just, you know, trying to look and be as comfortable as possible, because it's really interesting. If you just act and seem like you belong there and know what you're doing, people will they'll notice you, but they'll just kind of let you be and just assume that you're there for a reason. If you look at some of the, you know, great street photographers, like some of the New York ones, like Gary Winogrand, you know, they really got in the middle and just shot and shot. And, you know, people like obviously notice them, but they kind of just let them be. It's when you kind of slink to the side and look really nervous and are trying to be sneaky, that's when people really notice you, or they'll notice you no matter what, but that's when they'll be kind of concerned. So I just, you know, try to act as confident as possible. I can get in the, you know, I'll go in the middle of the street and things like that. And, you know, really, it's important to just try to understand how you look to everyone around you. As I mentioned with the lingering, if you're a fast walker, just try to walk slowly. A lot of people are always trying to get to that next amazing location. And it's almost like I mean, they miss so much because they're like, oh, I'll just, you know, I'm not going to start paying attention to photographing until I get to that next incredible location. Sometimes some of the most boring feeling areas or areas that you completely disregard can have some of the most interesting photographs if you just kind of slow down and take your time. So that's something to keep in mind. And acting, you know, acting, I think, is one of the most important things you can do. Just subtle acting. You know, I don't dress up like a tourist or anything like that. I just, mainly when I say acting, I mean just pretending that you don't notice the subjects that you're photographing. So a lot of times, you know, I'll shoot so quickly that nobody notices. I'll just kind of just shoot and move on. But when I really want to be candid, you know, maybe I'll aim up at a building first and I'll just move the camera, take the picture of the person and move it back as if I was looking around. But most importantly, it's just my body language just acts like I completely have no idea the person's there. Maybe my head's up a little bit or to the side. I'll just look like I'm just kind of spaced out a little bit. That really, just doing that well can allow you to get away with almost anything. You know, I can't tell you how, you know, I feel comfortable photographing anywhere. It doesn't have to be a busy street, just because I'm comfortable with the way kind of I look and people just kind of let me be. Now, what to say if you get caught? I think it's actually good for people to kind of stop you and say, hey, why did you take my photograph? Because you know, when you can disarm a situation like that, it will make you a lot more comfortable about doing it. And I think one of the important things is just, you know, some people, you just know, even if it's a good photograph, this person's not worth photographing. They're not going to like it. If they see me, it's going to be not great. So I think that's one of the most important things to do, of course. But, you know, if you get caught or if someone stops you, I just like to, you know, be honest. And I say, oh yeah, I'm a photographer. I'm doing a project on the streets and people and culture of New York. And I thought you looked, you know, amazing or fabulous. Flattery works really well. So if you're just kind of really nice and you just say, oh, you looked awesome, I'd love to send you the photograph, then really most of the time it's, you know, it will disarm a situation. If they seem uncomfortable, then just transition and just be like, you know, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I just thought you looked really cool. So I'm happy to delete the photograph if you want. So that always works. And if it happens to be the best photograph of your life, just you can sprint away. But usually it's not the best photograph of your life when someone stops you. Now, one thing I showed you both the cameras that I use. I do think it's really important and not always necessary. I mean, I've shot for a long time with a big SLR and a zoom lens with this type of work, but really prime lenses help a lot. I mean, I personally love wide angle I love 35 millimeter equivalent and 50 millimeter equivalent lenses. Those are just the two that I use strictly for street photography. And by using a prime lens, you really start to, get to know how the camera is going to see, even often without looking through the viewfinder. I shoot from the viewfinder whenever I can, but sometimes I'll just kind of shoot, with the camera by my chin when I need to. And I'm so used to it that I can get the scene how I want it, even without looking through the viewfinder. But it speeds you up. It allows you to be a little bit more spontaneous with your photography. And you just get so in tune with your camera with a prime lens that it just makes everything flow really well. So I really suggest trying a prime lens if you use zooms strictly. You will miss out on some photographs, of course, but I had a friend named Dave Beckerman who said whether you use a zoom or a prime, you still end up with the same amount of good shots. They're just going to be completely different. So you just kind of have to, if you miss a shot or can't get something because it's too far away, so be it. You're going to catch other shots that are right there that you would miss with the zoom lens. And I think small cameras are often really good to try because this type of photography, I think, is really good. We'll talk about this later. When you do it frequently, when you're going for little walks, or if you take a camera with you, just, and you have the camera with you in just normal places. It's, often I do this too. A lot of people, they only take their camera out when they go to these incredible locations. And they don't take the camera because, maybe it's a big camera, or they just don't feel like it, when they're going to just normal places, maybe walking to the supermarket or walking somewhere else. I think it's really important to take your camera to those situations sometimes, when you feel like the need to do that, or just to go for local walks and take it around. And a small camera will make this a lot easier, especially with a prime lens. Here's a photograph where I'm going to show you a few that were just really quick. It just happened, in a split second, and I had to kind of be ready. This guy, I was walking down the street and this guy just looked down at the last minute or last second. And, I had my camera pre-focused to a certain distance, which we'll talk about. It was in my hand already. It was kind of up near my eyes, and I just kind of took it quickly. And it happened to work out. And so that's kind of the fast moving thing that you'll get a lot of shots like this if you kind of, do things the right way. This one was with a DSLR and zoom lens. This is one I love. I just love the facial expression. It reminds me kind of the Mona Lisa, just with that kind of half smile and the look in the eyes. But it was just a really crowded, busy winter day on Fifth Avenue. And just kind of like a few people parted. And I saw this young woman with this look. In a split second, I was able to just quickly take the photograph. These are ones that you kind of you take it and you're like, I really hope I got that. Now, light, it's important to talk about, but it's interesting because, because this is such a fast moving form of photography, I'm often focusing as much attention on the subjects and what's going on. And, I'm thinking about the light, of course, especially when I set up my camera or I'm walking down the street, I think about where the light is coming from. But really a lot when I'm looking directly, a lot of what I'm looking for is just the subjects. And then the lighting and thinking about the lighting, it's more of a instinctual, quick thing. Same with the background. I kind of, over time, I felt I've gotten better at kind of seeing all those elements and putting them together. But the first thing I definitely try to notice is the subjects. So important things to think about is, of course, how strong is the light? What direction is it coming from? How strong is the contrast? And really important is your main subject in the highlights or shadows? And we'll talk a little bit just quick about camera settings, but I always expose my camera for the shady side of the street, because especially in a city with tall buildings, but even with, shorter buildings, with this fast moving street photography, 1 second you might see a great subject in the sun, and the next second you might see the best photograph of your life in the shade. And if your camera is not set up to get sharp shots in the shade, you'll miss that shot. So I think it's really important to set up your setting for the shady side of the street so you can shoot at both sides. Is the light making interesting patterns? Can you wait in an area with some great light and just put everything together? How is the light reflecting? This is important in New York, particularly in the wide avenues. I just love when the sun at the right time of day, when the sun is kind of shooting down the avenues. I love to photograph with the sun behind my subjects because the sun will hit the bright white pavement of the sidewalks and it'll reflect into people's skin. And so if you see a lot of like kind of Fifth Avenue or big wide avenue photography in New York, you'll just see that people's skin glow. It glows and it's really an incredible look. And night, I love to do street photography at night. No matter how good the ISO is on your cameras, there are, when you're doing handheld without a tripod street photography, there are some, places with no light that you're just not going to be able to get the shot. So what I end up doing is I tend to just hop from good lighting source to good lighting source and I wait around. Particularly, can be lampposts and things like that, but it's most often store window fronts, which have great light. So I'll kind of get close to the window front to put myself in between the light source and where the subjects will come from. And I'll just wait for them to come. And this allows you to kind of shoot, very similarly to that you would during the day and get sharp shots and things like that in tougher lighting situations. This one I had to wait for a taxi to come by and just kind of illuminate the foreground. Now, camera settings, I'm assuming you all know, camera settings very well. So I'll just kind of go over this quickly of how I like to do things. I don't usually, maybe if the lighting's really consistent or sometimes at night, I usually don't use manual just because of what I mentioned with the shadier sides and the sunny sides. And it's so fast that, changing your settings every time you turn around really takes your focus off of just watching the scene and photographing the scene. So I prefer either aperture or shutter priority, and most often I use aperture priority. But really, if you know the settings well, I mean, all three of these work well for street photography. They're great, fantastic, amazing street photographers who use all three of these, different settings. I like to use 1/250th of a second as my kind of base shutter speed for freezing motion during the day. So I'll just set it to aperture priority. If it's during the day, maybe I'll start at f8 or so. And as it gets lower, darker, I'll kind of use a lower number. But and then I'll check and make sure that my shutter speed is going faster than 200 or 250 of a second, and then I'm fine. At night, I'm fine going down to 1/125th, 1/80th, even 1/60th is okay. It'll be fine. But really, it'll really freeze motion if you're around the 250 kind of area. And I like to raise my ISO up like pretty high. Some people, a lot of people now are comfortable with this because newer cameras have such incredible ISOs. I typically during the day in New York at a sunny day, I have used about ISO 800. If I'm like in the middle of the sun for a long time, then I'll do 200 or 400, or if I'm on the beach or something. But, with the shady side and the sunny side, I'm always exposing for the shady side. So sunny day, I'm ISO 800, like, overcast or darker days, I go to 1600. And then dusk in the evening is 32 to 6400. And these Fuji cameras can handle it really well. The X100 is great. I'm fine with it at 6400. The GFX is like incredible up to, I don't even know. I haven't had to push it, much past 6400, but it looks incredible. And what that allows you to do is just to have a fast shutter speed and a decent depth of field. And I really like to have more depth of field in my photographs. I like to, shoot at f8 whenever possible. If I'm in the middle of the sun, maybe I'll go to f11. Of course, I'll shoot lower when it gets darker, all the way down to, f2 often. But the reason for this is not necessarily for the look. I love the look of shallow depth of field photography for street photography. I love the photographers that do it. But the thing is that, you kind of never know what the scene is going to be. And often there are multiple subjects at different depths. Often there's, great background or a great subject. And if you're just walking around with a very shallow depth of field, it's hard to get these shots, to have the important pieces to be sharp. So, for that reason, I like a decent depth of field. And also, things happen so fast that you often miss the focus. And so, if you're shooting at f2.8, you're not giving yourself much leeway. At f8, particularly with a wide angle lens, 35 or kind of more normal 50, if you miss the focus, you're still a good chance that it's going to be like pretty sharp, sharp enough. We're really kind of setting these settings just to let the camera get out of our way. So it just kind of is us walking around, seeing something really great, and we can just shoot and not have to kind of think too much or worry too much. Here's a scene where the guy, after I took this photo, he laughed and looked at me and, just said, please don't show my mama. This, it was kind of fast. It just happened quickly. And because I had a decent depth of field, I was really able to get all these different elements, which are important to the scene, all sharp. Same with this one. Now, the important question, what makes an interesting photograph? I have no idea. The thing about street photography is when you start to figure out what you find interesting, I think that's when you become on the path towards becoming a really good street photographer. This type of work is just, it's so personal. We start out, a lot of photographers start out and they just, they photograph the most interesting person that they see, try to get them sharp, try to do this and that. But over time, I think you start to have tendencies. You start to notice specific people. They maybe people who have some sort of sensibility that mixes with your own. Maybe you're, attracted to happier people or sadder people or, different types of moments. And this is, I think we'll talk about editing later, but this kind of, you start to figure this out when you're editing and you start to notice these photographs that you like and you put them together. And so over time, I think that's when you really start to just build your voice with this type of work. It's great when you look at the work of other photographers to see that developed voice and how they took it in their own way. So I think that's really something important to think about when you're editing is just, what are you actually kind of attracted to the most out there? You'll often find that some of the photographs that you like the most, that you think are the most interesting, are maybe not necessarily the ones that other people like. People would just be like, why the hell did you take that? But I think those are actually the most interesting photographs to go forward. And particularly if you put them in a group of images, I think those are the ones that will grow on people over time. One of my favorite books is, of course, The Americans by Robert Frank. And he loved to photograph, items of kind of Americana, the jukebox, the American flag. So, of course, things that, I really like adding to my photographs, and it's very easy because they're everywhere these days. But, it's kind of items that are, not Americana, it's just the world now, but the coffee cup, the cell phone, the shopping bag, and the headphones. Headphones, everywhere, of course, but in New York, they've had a really profound effect here. New York, the special thing about the city has been just going out for a walk or, going wherever you go and just having these just special random interactions. You see people and bump into people and have these moments with, people from all different types of backgrounds. And it's so much of that is unplanned. And the headphones just stop that. And so you're starting to see more and more people wear the headphones when they're walking around and just being completely disconnected from their surroundings. And so that really got me kind of fascinated. I'm fascinated with that idea in general, but headphones are something that I definitely pay attention to because it's really kind of interesting to see how quickly things changed in certain areas of the city. There still is a lot of that amazing interaction, but a lot of it is being kind of crushed. Now, I said I don't know what makes an interesting photograph, but there are some things to think about that can help you make your photographs interesting, of course. So the first is content and story. what I was talking about, your voice, what you're trying to say, um, just trying to put together some sort of consistent thing. And it doesn't have to be, a specific story. It could be a feeling. All your photographs, could have just a specific emotion or feeling or tone to them. And I consider that to definitely be a story. Um, Motion, gesture, and specific images. So that's when I was talking about, looking at, people's eyes, or the gesture in their bodies, their hands, their legs. I look for people that are showing their emotions on their sleeve, so to speak. So I'd rather I would love a photograph of just a nondescript person with just an incredible expression or feeling to them than the flashiest, most interesting person just walking down the street without any emotion to them. Form, of course, is very important: light, color, tone, and composition. The best photographs tend to kind of bring together that, emotion or story with some incredible elements of form. And looking beneath the surface. It's hard to kind of explain this, but not all of them, some of the best street photographs really just have something underneath the surface. Maybe they're obvious in certain ways, but there's something underneath that kind of grows on you. It's similar to the kind of the last interpretation and ambiguity. Some of the best street photographs, like, maybe you'll look at it and you'll feel different things about it on different days based on how you're feeling. Maybe it can grow on you. Some of them are not just so in your face and obvious. And I think those are not always the best ones, but often the best, my favorite ones. And consistency. So street photographs, street photography is really a genre that shines in books. It allows people to kind of tell their story, and a lot of the images play off each other and really make each other stronger, make them stronger. But consistency is interesting to think about, because consistency, I think of it as your own sensibility. And I think that's where the consistency comes through. You don't have to, photograph everything in black and white with the same lens and have the same exact look to your photographs to be consistent. Maybe that helps in specific projects or specific books that you do. But I think when you, really kind of tap into, what you like to photograph and who you are, the consistency will shine through in your images, no matter what camera lens, post-processing you like to use. You look like Martin Parr, Martin Parr image when you see it. There are photographers that you kind of know their work when you see it, no matter what project it is or what they're actually shooting. This photograph, I think, has something like 36 different devices in it. Now, imperfection. It's a really important thing with street photography. And I think it's especially important when, working with, landscape photographers or certain genres of photography where you have a lot of time to set up the photograph and set everything in place. And this type of photography is just so fast and so quick. And because of that, we celebrate imperfection. And so I'll read this just quickly. A street photograph does not have to be perfect to be good. The nature of a good street photograph gives us a glimpse into a slice of reality, and perfection can ruin this feeling of realness because life isn't perfect. This is why grain, angled horizons, cut off people, or slightly out of focus, or motion blur are all very common in street photography. Sometimes imperfections will ruin a photograph, but other times they will make it that much better. You never know kind of when it ruins it or makes it better. But, there are a lot of street photographs that, are just, blurry to the point where if it was a landscape photograph, you'd throw it out, but it just has something special to it, even though it's blurry. There's a lot more leeway. And sometimes when a street photograph is just too perfect, it doesn't necessarily feel real. It kind of takes it out of that moment of that's kind of special, unplanned moment. So I would, if you're doing this type of work, give yourself leeway. Don't worry too much about the little things, because if it's an interesting moment and it's a great photograph, it'll stand out, whether or not there's some sort of technical thing that, is a little off. like if you look at the work of Gary Winogrand, he often shot a lot of his photographs off kilter. You know, it was a way to add a little bit more of different back. You know, you can kind of have a little bit more in the scene by doing that. But really, it made it feel unplanned. Yeah, that's I think the most important thing is just it added energy, it added diagonals, it made it feel like this wasn't something that you could possibly plan. This is a photograph of someone taking a butt selfie. Um, and, blown out highlights. It's not, the sharpest image. You can see a lot of the grain here. Um, it doesn't really matter. It just, it still looks great. It's still kind of a funny moment. So it's, it just depends on the image. Similar to this was kind of a shot at dusk. Where I was just moving a little too much and I didn't quite get it still. And, the blur looks almost painterly here. Makes this kind of, the cigarette almost look like it's floating and really kind of focuses attention on this, great facial expression here. So sometimes when you screw up, it really works. And many times it will just completely screw up the photograph. Now, combining elements. I think this is something really important to talk about because I see there's a lot of street photographers, particularly when they're starting out, they have almost a tunnel vision. And you notice your subject and you take the photograph. And that's often the best way to do it. Often that's where the best shot is. But, really, I think it's important to try to notice the surrounding elements also, because street photography is about kind of often showing a place, a sense of place, giving kind of a making kind of complex things. And so maybe you're adding two subjects together, maybe the background's really important. So I think it's important to develop your peripheral vision. And that's one of the reasons why I like wide angle lenses, because it allows you to get a great subject, big in the scene, but also to include a lot of the surrounding elements. And so that's not like a general thing, like this is always better. It's just something to develop as part of what you like to do. Here's one where I was taking a portrait of this young woman. And, as I mentioned, I kind of waited for a moment where she didn't think I was taking her photograph. And I saw this other young woman walking kind of with a whole bunch of coffee cups, and it just kind of fit the scene perfectly and really kind of made it a little bit more complex and more going on here. When I do my workshops, my group workshops, I, often give people a contest who can photograph someone carrying the most coffee cups. And someone in one of my workshops, they got, within 5 minutes of walking out the door, they got a photograph of someone carrying 8 coffee cups. So I haven't been able to beat that. Here's an old one from Occupy Wall Street way back when, where each part of this photograph would be its own really interesting photograph, or pretty good photograph, but together it all makes it work that much better. Now, setting a stage is also really important to talk about, because as I mentioned, I like to pick often, pick locations and just wait for interesting people to walk by and, see great backgrounds and stuff. But this can go wrong as well. A lot of times I see, you see these photographs with fantastic backgrounds, like the background is the photograph. And then people just wait for any person to walk in and capture the person in that background. And the person just doesn't add anything to the scene. But the people, but you can see how people think that it needs a person in the photograph to be considered a street photograph. If you have a fantastic background, just take the photograph of the background. It's going to be, great. If a person, comes in, you need that person to kind of stand up to the background and really fit in. So there's some times where, setting a stage and waiting for a person works out really well. And there's other times where it feels forced, and just capturing that background would be a great way to kind of create a sense of place, or create a little, sense of place. Here's one where I was trying to photograph for a long time. I mean, 8 years or so, or something like that, of that, iconic steam that you see in the city, without having it be too kind of cheesy almost. And I love bike messengers. So I've also been trying for a long time to try to get a great photograph of a bike messenger. And then finally I got them both together in one photograph. And ever since, I've never had to take a photograph of steam or bike messengers ever again. Here's one where I was waiting around. I love this light. This is my favorite corner in New York. It's in Soho. It's the corner of Prince and Broadway. It's a wonderful place to photograph people. This is right where the looters went the first weekend during all that craziness a few weeks ago. But I love this photograph with the lights. So I was waiting here. And because I was hanging around in this corner, and I often just hang around in this corner, this great guy kind of came in and sat down and just completely did not notice me or disregarded me because I had already been there and I looked like I was just kind of photographing around. So I was able to get these great photographs here. So it's interesting to think about which, photograph I like the best. I probably like the first one with no people. I just love how this looks on its own. And I love this. I like this one with this guy kind of sitting here. This one, I wanted this to work out so well, but I wanted it to be this incredible complex image with so much going on here. But I just don't think it quite was right. I don't think it came together exactly in the way I was hoping. So it's interesting to think about which one is best. I like these two equally, but I don't think this photograph on the left here needs a person to be an interesting photograph. Now, color, black and white. Obviously it's personal preference. I personally shoot everything in RAW. So I can figure that out later. But it's really important, I think, for consistency, shooting in color or black and white. Excuse me. Let me just take a sip of water. I've seen a few photo books where people have mixed color and black and white together and made it work really well. But I have not been able to do that. I've tried and I just can't make it work in a great way. So I like to keep my specific kind of projects in either color or black and white. And I think that really helps with the consistency of it. Black and white, of course, has, this really timeless quality, whereas color feels a lot more modern. But I like to flip this one on its head almost. And I like to take really modern images and put them in black and white, because that kind of timeless feel takes you a little bit out of the fact that it's modern and sets a kind of a place and makes you think that, maybe this isn't so normal. Maybe this is, something that should be, thought about a little bit more. Faces really stand out more in black and white as you take away all the color distractions. So it's not a, general thing that, if you have a great face, put it in black and white. But it's definitely something to consider. And of course, there are a lot of street images where just there's some color distractions that kind of ruin the photograph, and you just putting it into black and white can save it. Here's one where I just, this woman, with the muted tones and kind of, stiffness in her body. And then there's just kind of this disconnect between that and, her phone cover with the, red flowing dress and relaxed looking woman. Here's one where, I waited for this kid. It's on a famous basketball court, Rucker Park in New York. Just waited for him to look up at me, and the eye contact was really important. And people always ask this, so I'll just bring it up quickly. The issue of photographing children is a tough thing to figure out what to do. It's if you look at the history of street photography, I would say 30 or more % of the most amazing photographs had kids in them. That was easier back when, the camera was seen as such a special thing. And these days it's much tougher. You can get, people really angry at you. So I know street photographers who don't photograph kids at all. I know incredible street photographers who photograph everything and they think it's all important to photograph. Obviously it's a personal choice. But when photographing kids, if their situation's right and it's the right photograph, you've seen a couple already. I think they're really, great photographs and tasteful. If the situation's right, I'll definitely take the photograph. But you know, if it's a mediocre or I'm not sure, I'll definitely not take the photograph. And it's, you know, sometimes it's kind of one of those things where it's either I'll be very obvious about it. If I see a great moment, I want to take it, I'll just be really upfront and obvious. Or sometimes it's just a quick shot and nobody's ever, you know, going to notice. And I think it's a tasteful photograph, and I'm personally okay with that. So that's really something, you know, that's up to you. But you have to, with photographing kids, you really have to, you know, be aware of the potential consequences and, you know, what could happen. Here's a photograph where it's obviously much better in color. It looks amazing in color, but it fits really well with a project that I'll talk about called that I'm doing called Lux City, which is a black and white project. And so, you know, of course, I had to put it into black and white to fit in with the project. You got to do what you got to do. Do we want to take a second break just to, if anyone has any questions? If not, I can just keep going. Let me see. So yeah, if anyone wants to unmute, otherwise I'll just keep going.
Any questions, anybody?
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'll keep going. We can do it. Oh, yep.
I asked you a question about lenses. You see, you like to use wide angle lenses, and I think most street photographers would like that. But it seems like if you use a long lens, prime or zoom, then doesn't that tend to avoid the problem of you know, people noticing you, or you getting into their space and things like that?
So certainly, and I have nothing against long lenses for street photography. There are, I mean, amazing photographers who do it with long lenses. I mean, one of my favorite photographers, Saul Leiter, you know, use a lot of long lenses. The thing, you know, for me, it's first of all, from the perspective of people noticing you, I think it's almost the opposite for me. It's like if I have a, you know, a longer, bigger lens and I'm, you know, I'm a little further back, people still tend to notice me. So it's like, you know, I feel almost a little bit more obvious that way. That's just me, of course. Whereas, you know, when I'm with a wide angle, lighter lens, you know, even though I'm getting close and shooting quickly in the middle of everything, you know, it just, you know, the way I tend to do it, it just looks comfortable. It feels comfortable. People tend to really disregard me, even though I'm like kind of floating around like street corners and stuff like that. So I personally feel more comfortable like getting close with a wide angle lens than actually staying a little further back. I know that might seem counterintuitive. And it takes a little time to get comfortable shooting this way, and kind of seeing where it works and where it doesn't. And then also I personally just like, for a lot of the photographs, just with a wide angle lens, you know, when you get closer, it makes your subject a little bit bigger and makes your background a little bit smaller. So it really allows you to, you know, combine a person in a background in a really great way, or multiple subjects in a really great way. So, you know, that too. And I find when I'm close to my subjects, I notice a little bit more, you know, I see a little bit more details and more expressions. So yeah, that's the reason why I like to use wide angle lenses. But that's definitely just me and definitely just a personal preference.
Thank you.
Yep. Anybody else? Okay. All right. So I'll keep going. We can do some questions after if anybody has them. So as I mentioned with photographing backgrounds, street photography without people is, I think, really important. And I do see photographers who, you know, they show me their, you know, street photography work and it's all people. It's just 100% people. And I think that's missing out on an entire half of the equation. Backgrounds are incredibly interesting and incredibly important to photograph. But it's important to think about what makes a street photograph with that doesn't have people in it. It's different from, like, you know, an urban landscape picture. I tend to think of urban landscape pictures as pictures that are taken for the purpose of making something look as beautiful or as glamorous or as interesting, you know, maybe not interesting, but it's just beautiful or as glamorous as possible. Something that you take for the purpose of putting on your wall, which is a wonderful thing to do. I do that all the time. But I think of a street photograph without people as, you know, trying to, as I talk about things under the surface, trying to show a little bit of something, a little emotion, setting a stage for something. There's a little bit more behind it. And the goal of taking that photograph is not to make something look as beautiful or as glamorous as possible. It's great if it looks beautiful. It's great if it looks glamorous, but that's not the kind of primary goal of it. So that's what I think the difference is. I'll show you a couple. Here's one. This just makes me, being in New York, that kind of feeling that you get of the pace and the domineering and the, just the kind of often kind of suffocating feeling that, gives all of us New Yorkers anxiety. This image kind of definitely makes me feel like that, similar to this one. If you're familiar with the new Hudson Yards development, pardon my candor here, but one of the, ugliest new additions to New York. It's a completely new luxury neighborhood that was built over an old train yard. Incredibly impressive, but it's basically right now it's about something like 8-ish glass skyscrapers, and they're going to build a whole another bunch of them on another part of coming up. But it's really interesting because you walk and you look at the architecture and it's sleek and modern, but there's nothing to it. You look at it and like you see nothing. It's just glass reflecting glass. There's no, really, there's kind of these interesting lines and things like that, but there's just no character to it at all. It feels really kind of dystopian almost. So this is my attempt to portray that, an image with a lot of sleek stuff going on, but really it's just a blank white image at the same time. Here's a photograph of the side of a Harry Winston store on Fifth Avenue, right on one of the main corners of Fifth Avenue. And I like it because, when I was talking about how, New York, some of the things that New York is, known for and makes it interesting, one of the things is just being a unique place. And I think over time, New York has and major cities have become so similar to each other. And so this, I get that, that's what I was thinking when I took that photograph. So I think this is an important thing to talk about, using your eyes instead of the viewfinder. All the work is done with your eyes, so you need to think about that and train them. And this doesn't mean kind of shooting from the hip, shooting with the camera not at your eyes. I'll do that when I need to, of course. I'll shoot below, my chin or something, but I try to use the viewfinder whenever possible. But what it really means is to try to notice your subjects and notice your scenes, with your eyes before you put the camera to your eye and take the shot. When I work with photographers, I see some of them just stick their eyes in the camera and they just look around forever like that way. And it's just such a constricting view that it really, you miss so much stuff that's going on. So I like to just kind of look around like I don't have a camera at all. I look around and I wait till I see something and then I just, bring the camera to my eye and shoot. So I think it's a really important thing to think about and to try to do. But it's not something that's, really is necessarily natural for everybody at first. Now, zone focusing, I'll just explain it quickly. It's one of those things that it's like super easy to just show people how to do it. And it's still, it's not bad to explain it. But if you have any questions about that, just let me know after. Zone focusing is the act of, turning your autofocus off. Now, I autofocus for about 50% of my street shooting. I'll just use the center point and, click and then, compose as I need to. I do it more with a 50 millimeter than a 35. I zone focus a lot more with a 35, but I do sometimes zone focus with a 50 millimeter. And what it is just turning your camera to manual focus and setting a pre-focus distance. Typically I do between 8 and 10 feet. So often I do kind of 9-ish feet. And, if you're using a wide angle lens and you have a decent depth of field, such as like f8, so say you're using a 35 millimeter lens and an f8 and you're focused at about 9 feet, that means that just, everywhere from maybe 5 or 6 feet to 13 to 15 feet, it's gonna be pretty in focus. Obviously as you get further out towards that range, it gets less and less in focus. But that really, that's the kind of meat of where you're, doing street photography. That's kind of the distance. So really it allows you to not have to focus anymore. And that lack of having to lock in the autofocus, and it frees you up so much, it speeds you up so much, and it allows you to shoot in a much more spontaneous way. And there's so many photographs that I've gotten that I would not have been able to get if I was using autofocus, even though I do use autofocus a lot of the time. So I really recommend trying it out. It's harder to do with 50 millimeter and beyond because, the look of the depth of field gets a little, it just, if you kind of miss the focus, it kind of screws up the sharpness more. Whereas, wider angle lens, you'll have a lot more of the scene that'll look in focus. So I would suggest kind of a 35 millimeter or wider to try it with. Here's a photograph of two people just kind of bumping into each other, and it was just a split second where this man started just screaming at this woman. And, because I was pre-focused, I was just able to take such a quick shot. And if you think about it, if I was auto-focusing, there's no way I would have been able to get this photograph. I would have back focused it here, or I would have had to quickly, focus here, and the composition would have been completely off. So just not only the speed of zone focusing, but it just allows you to compose exactly how you want to in a split second. One of my favorite photographs of Robert Frank's is the crowd photograph on Canal Street. This is also on Canal Street in the city. It's just such an incredible photograph of crowds, and I've been trying to photograph crowds that come together ever since I saw that photograph. And I've probably two that I like. This is the one that I really like. And pre-focused, I like this background. Kind of liked all the elements here, and so I pre-focused to about the distance where the people were walking by. And that allowed me to just not worry about focus anymore, and just look at all the subjects in my periphery as they were coming through, and just to, I took a bunch of shots, of course, but really, it allows you to kind of time it much better. So this is something that would have been much harder to do if I had to lock in the autofocus. How will an image age? It's just a really important question, I think, to think about. There's no answer to that, of course. But I think it tends to, there's a lot that people take for granted. There's a lot that I take for granted that seems like normal and everyday. They just, because of that, you don't photograph. And that'll be interesting, in 5 or 10 years when whatever that thing is completely disappears. There's a lot of things that change really fast in New York. And you're just like, it disappears and you're like, shoot, why didn't I photograph that when I had the chance? So I think that's an important thing to keep in the back of your head. When I talk about, liking to photograph cell phones and things like that, cell phones are an interesting thing because it's just such a, it's everywhere. And so it makes the photographs not stand out as much, even though I think it's a really interesting thing that's everyone's lost in their phones. But so what that means is that, normally what would be a good photograph just is run of the mill, because it's really easy to photograph people staring and lost in their cell phones. So I think, you still should take them, but there's a much higher bar for staring at a cell phone image to be a really good image. So I have a couple that I like that I think work really well, and we're kind of everything works together. This is one of them, but it because it's just everywhere, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't photograph it and you should disregard it. Here's a photograph of someone else's graffiti, but this is a message that I really think is a glue image. That really kind of, explains a lot of what I'm, part of what I'm trying to show. As you've noticed, as I mentioned earlier, if you've seen, like, a lot of these images are, black and white, and these are all part of a project that I finished called Luck City. And the goal of that project was to kind of show the changing nature of New York over the last, probably, I started noticing it more after 9/11, and I started shooting this project probably 10-ish years ago. But the goal was to kind of show, the changing nature as the city became safer and wealthier people started moving back and the city started becoming more expensive. You just notice a lot more kind of luxurification, conformity, a lot of kind of consumption, and those kind of things. And you notice a lot of people there's a lot, they look a lot lonelier. There's a lot of stress and there's a lot of anxiety. There's always been a lot of anxiety, but it's kind of a different type of anxiety almost. Um, you kind of see, back when the city was kind of tougher and things, and you could live a little bit freer. People seem like they had a lot of people. This is an overgeneralization, but there's a lot of people that had like purpose, and now you see people with less purpose here, and maybe they're drowning it in consumption and eating out and things like that, and it's something that as time goes on, it's you see it more and more. And as I was just talking about themes and projects, it's really interesting when you think about how to create a street photography project. And not all street photographers work in projects. There's some that just don't, classify their work into, kind of groups like that. And that's a great way. There's some great photographers who do that. But street photography really works well in projects and books. And so there's some photographers that think of projects right away or ideas right away, and they just go out and photograph it. And that's a great way to do it. The other way, which I tend to do more, actually all my projects tend to start this way, is, I'll go and photograph a place, or I'll start to notice things in my images, and then I'll just start to develop that over time. So like the Lux City project, really, I just started shooting and I started noticing this kind of idea probably about 10 years ago. And I started over the time, I started kind of figuring out what I was shooting, and I started reading more about, gentrification and, modern things, things that were happening in the city. And, I started, reading all different types of writers who like to write about that. And it really kind of got me fascinated in what was going on in the city. And it really informed the project. And so, the last 5 years of it, as I really could put words to what I was photographing, I started to get more and more photographs that really worked for the project. And even a lot of the early ones that I thought were great kind of fell by the wayside. And I'll talk a little bit later about how I kind of switched things up completely, and shot with the GFX camera in color and completely different thing that I'm used to. But really, that this project, I don't even know where it's going. I've just been doing it for a couple of years, and it just starts by just walking. The goal is just to explore as much of Brooklyn as I can, and then just kind of figure it out as I go along. It says, talk to me because I'm lonely. Now, editing and consistency. I think the three pillars to just becoming a really good street photographer. The first one is everything in here, just learning the kind of basics and the things for how to shoot and when you're out there. I think the second pillar is really educating yourself on the history of street photographers, because you can kind of see how we all have the same content out there, but you can see how just photographers took them in completely different directions, and then you can take what they did and bring what you like into your own work. And then the third part is editing. I think editing is incredibly important. And as I mentioned, that's where you kind of figure out what you're doing. That's where you start to notice the photographs that you really like, and you put them together. And there's so much stuff I'm talking about here today, that you don't have to think about all that stuff when you're shooting. It's after, when you're editing, you can kind of assess what you did right or wrong, or maybe what you should try, test out something different. So I think editing is really where that all comes together, and I think it's where that consistency is born. I think that consistency is something that you build. I don't necessarily think maybe it's something innate. It's definitely something innate, but it's not something that you start photographing in a consistent way with this genre right away. It takes time, and it takes a lot of editing. Here's one where I was trying to get a good shot that I liked of someone vape smoking for the last few years while it was really popular. And, you know, I took a ton of them. And I have two that I liked. You saw a previous one, and this is my favorite one, where it finally got something that worked really well. Here's a photograph of a sample sale in Soho. It's amazing how many people will wait in line if you tell them something's, you know, 50% off. People filling out job applications. This is why I don't visit New York in holiday season. Now, weird and different images. I put this in there because it's important to know how other people think about your work and how other people react to it. But the most important thing is that if you respond to it. Anything that you like, keep it in. You know, really don't be afraid to take images that people might not like or might not get. And as I mentioned a few times, I think it's really important to embrace spontaneity and to go with your gut. It's, you know, such a fast moving form, as I talked about many times, but you know, when I feel like something's going to happen, I'll take the photograph. And as I've gotten, you know, more experience with this, I'll often just kind of go to take the photograph, and sometimes I'll pull back. So I take less photographs than I used to, but, you know, still I'll, you know, when I feel something, I'll just kind of go for it. And what that means is you're going to take a ton of crappy photographs. So when I'm editing, I'll put my photographs in, I'll immediately give 0 stars that are nothing or I don't like, 3 stars that I'm not sure about, and 5 stars that I love. And I'll just delete all the 0 stars just to keep my archive smaller. So, you know, it's not, don't worry about taking that photograph. The real thing is just to not show the crappy photographs, you know, not share them, but everybody takes them and everybody takes a ton of them. So I think you should just, you know, try to, you know, be loose with this type of photography and especially at first, but, you know, even as you get very experienced, when in doubt, take the photograph and then figure it out later. I mean, here's another one where it was just these two came around the corner, and if I wasn't pre-focused and, you know, had the camera in my hand and just went with it, you know, really, you know, getting the eyes here and here it was like, it's such a split-second thing. Now, the final section that I'm just going to talk about is based on a kind of project. I don't have a name for it really, but it's kind of quieter Brooklyn. And it works well with socially distant photography right now as we're kind of doing the social distancing thing. When I finished the last 2 projects in Manhattan, I moved to Brooklyn a couple years ago. I had a kid and I was just kind of looking to escape that crazy New York that you saw in the rest of the photographs, and to kind of go to like older areas and just explore the borough and just try to go into areas that are much more like suburban feeling, much quieter, much less people, and to photograph in those areas. It means a lot more, you know, backgrounds and things that I'm photographing, but I'm also photographing people. And, you know, I decided to shoot with the GFX and get the GFX for this project at just this way of shooting. So I use the X100 when I go into Manhattan, and I shoot that type of work, and I use the medium format GFX when I do this type of work. And so there were a few reasons that I decided to do this. One is I really wanted to do this type of work in color. I think, you know, when you're photographing a lot more backgrounds and details and stuff, I think colors can be really important for that. And so the color had the, you know, just really beautiful depth of field look for some of those images. But also, I had been watching something from one of my favorite photographers, Alex Soth, and you know, he said something really interesting. He takes these really intimate. He's not really, you know, classified as a street photographer, but he does kind of background and portraits. And he uses, for a lot of his projects, he uses a large format camera. And, he would travel around different areas that of the country that he didn't know anybody. And he would just get people to invite them into their home and just like open up. And there's such intimate photographs. And it's like, how did he do this? And he said having that big camera and that large format, it just felt special to people. So they saw him like, the strange looking guy, walking down some suburban area, that camera, made it seem like he was meant to be there and doing something right. And it was a special moment, and it allowed people to really open up to him. And I think that was one of the keys to, his work, was using that camera. And so I'm not about to drag a large format camera around Brooklyn. But when I was walking around these quieter areas with less people, shooting in the way I did in Manhattan, that kind of quick and sneaky way, you're still noticeable. Like when you and there's only one other person on the street, you're still like, no matter what, you're going to stand out. And I still, I try to shoot in a candid way for certain shots when I need to, but that the bigger camera, I felt just makes me feel more legitimate there. It stands out so much that it's like, I'm there for a reason. And so I think it really, the look of it works really well when I'm photographing, and I can still photograph candidly. I do a bunch more portraits for this as well, or I kind of take quick shots where I nod at the person. And it manages to be really comfortable, and it's a newer form that I've only been doing for a couple of years, but I managed to feel comfortable with it despite it being, a lot more obvious, and just completely different environment. And so as we've been talking about, it's important to think about the question of how you view the world and the areas that you're capturing. There's a slide later on near the end, which it's just, I like to pick an area, photograph an area that you go to frequently, photograph around where you live. With my mailing list right now, I'm doing a contest where it's called 5 blocks from home. And it's particularly good in a pandemic. We're not going too far away. But it's just what you can come up with, only going 5 blocks from your house, or even in your home. And I think that's an incredible way to develop your photography, and just to kind of, when you do it over and over, you start to notice more and more. So it's just something that I think that's important to think about. This picture was a portrait. And I've been working on more portraits. Obviously, that's a lot tougher now with the pandemic and everyone wearing masks. So I'm kind of putting a little bit of that on hold unless I, see the right situation until that kind of is over with. But this is one where I said, hey, can I take a picture of you guys? And the guy in the blue started to get down to like kind of almost pose a little bit. And I had to stop him. I just be like, no, stay there. Like, just, look exactly how you look. Just, be natural. And I want to take it like that. And he just went back to exactly how he was. And so it is, it's a portrait, but it feels like a candid moment at the same time. And so I often like to, when I do portraits of people, tell them to, stay how they are if they look great, or I can tell them to just like say, hey, stand there in a comfortable way, pose yourself, and just look natural. Like, maybe look like you're not being photographed, or or I'll talk to them or something like that. I try to take the feeling of them being photographed out of the equation as much as possible, which is hard to do often, but when it works, it really works. And I think people need that direction, because otherwise they're going to look at you and they're going to kind of ham it up, give you that fake smile or something like that. And you just want people to kind of be real. Here's one where, in areas where there's less people and like, more suburban, quieter areas, you're going to go a long time without getting good shots of people. It's a lot of, more of the project, maybe 2/3 or 3/4 or something, I'm assuming will be backgrounds. And so you get some great ones like that, but you're like waiting, you're like, I'm never going to get a good shot of a person here ever again. But that's like that. This was a moment where I had went weeks without, really getting something I liked of a person. And then I go see this great abandoned building, and I walk up to it, and then I just see a bunch of kids smoking weed in the back of it here. And so, it's one of those things where it's street photography is a very optimistic form of photography. I think you have to be optimistic that the best moment's going to be around the corner. You have to enjoy the walk. You have to kind of not be frustrated when those, you're not getting what you want to get, because when you start to get too frustrated about that, you start to kind of, not really stop noticing what's going on. When you start to be optimistic that the best moment's around the corner, then you're kind of always looking. And I think that's when you really can see more and capture more. If anyone, I don't know if anyone's been here, but one of the most incredible places to visit in all of New York is Greenwood Cemetery. I happen to live like a few blocks from there. It just has these incredible views. It's the highest point in Brooklyn. And repetition. This is one of the reasons why I think, maybe a smaller camera is often good with a prime lens, because you can take it around with you. But I think this type of photography is done really well when you just take camera out with you for a little bit of time frequently to similar areas. Of course, you should travel and do it. Of course, there's all different types of things to do, but I think you really develop your eye, you develop your hand-eye coordination, and you kind of develop a consistent voice by shooting frequently. And so I'll often, like when I'm going somewhere that is not photography related, I'll often just leave 20 minutes early and take my camera. I'll go on very frequent half-an-hour walks with the camera. And it really builds up that way. There's many half-an-hour walks where I come back with not a single, often I don't even take a photograph. And then some days I'll go for half-an-hour walk and take, 30 photographs. There's no rhyme or reason, but I think repetition is like the number one important thing for this type of photography. In Brooklyn, there are a ton of great front yard displays that are just really amazing. So that's one thing I photograph as well, walking around here. I mentioned photograph where you live. A couple more photographs. Now forget it all, be instinctive, be spontaneous, and have fun. All the stuff we've talked about, think about it when you're editing, but really the goal is just to enjoy the walk and to have as much fun as possible. And before we have questions, or if anyone has any questions, I just want to just show you my website for anyone who wants to kind of learn a little bit more. So if you go to my website, it's James Maher, M-A-H-E-R, photography. You can just Google James Maher. If you go under books, I have some kind of resources which I think are great to check out. If you see here, it's a history of street photographers. I add to this as frequently as possible, and hopefully my internet will work to open this page. Yeah, so it's, I organized it into city, urban, American, suburban, and foreign. And so I was talking about Alex Soth. There's write-ups for all these photographers. And so, I was talking about the backgrounds and these great portraits that he does, just traveling around. So it's a really interesting history of photographers there. If you're looking for cameras for street photography and the lenses, I have a link, the best cameras for street photography, which talks about all the different types. And then I love street photography books. It's one of my favorite things, aspects of the genre. So I have the best street photography books. So it's a whole list of different books that you can look in that you might be interested in. If anyone of you are ever in New York, I do give private photography tours and workshops, and I frequent group photography tours and workshops, weekend group workshops for whenever this pandemic is over. And just a couple other things. If you're interested in editing, I have an editing for street photography class to get here. And then I have a free New York photographer's travel guide for whoever comes to New York. And the final thing is I wrote this 300-page book on street photography, takes everything into even more detail. There's two books. It's The Essentials of Street Photography, which is kind of all the, things to know. And then Street Photography Conversations is 8 interviews with well-known street photographers in a variety of genres about how they work.